Welcome everybody. Thank you for signing on to this presentation. As you are aware, every year in September we have our AGM for Salisbury Foundation Trust. This year will be somewhat different on the basis that we have a situation where we cannot gather together in the Arts Centre as we normally do. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Marsden. I'm the chairman at Salisbury Foundation Trust, and I'm your compere, as it were, for this presentation. What I will do is I'll introduce some of my exec colleagues who will talk about the challenges that we faced in 2019-20, but also some of the challenges we faced in 2020, of which I'm sure you've been aware. The first thing I'm going to do is hand over to my chief executive colleague for 2019-20, which is Cara Charles Barks. As you are no doubt aware, Cara has now left Salisbury and has moved as the chief executive for the RUH in Bath. So she will give her view of the last financial year, but we're also fortunate in having our new chief executive with us today. And Stacey Hunter, who has taken over from Cara, will follow Cara, and she will introduce herself and talk about herself and her experience, but also the challenges she feels she faces here in Salisbury, to give you some indication of the future direction of the organisation. So without further ado, here is Cara.
I'm delighted to talk to you today about our achievements across 2019-20 here at Salisbury Hospital. I'm incredibly proud of this organisation, incredibly proud of the staff that work here, and as a community we're so fortunate to have an organisation like Salisbury delivering our services and committed to our overall health and well-being. This year has been busy for us, if I'm honest, and certainly 2020 brought a whole range of challenges that were unexpected and unprecedented. Yet again, we found ourselves in the midst of a major incident. This one not just Salisbury based, but obviously nationally and internationally based through this spread of COVID-19. This organisation again showed why it's so incredibly valuable for the local community. We worked rapidly and quickly to put the right measures in place to keep you safe and also keep our staff safe. We responded to the demand quickly, we created COVID-safe areas, and all of the organisation responded to the emergency that we had at hand. And I'm delighted to say that we responded in a way that kept you safe, kept our staff safe, and again showed the true merit of this organisation. I'm incredibly proud of what we do here. This organisation has yet again shown that it delivers services with care and compassion, but absolutely that outstanding care sits at the heart of everything that we do. Throughout the last year, patient safety and quality of care have remained our top priorities, and we aim to build on our Cqc Good rating, which was received in March 2019. Our team here are absolutely committed to delivering services that are outstanding, and we're working hard to improve all of our services. Our services are delivered by over 4,800 staff, and they work tirelessly to deliver that high quality care for our local population. And we've seen them work differently over the last 12 months as they've adjusted to new ways of working, but absolutely become much more focused on their links with community partners to deliver great services. I'm delighted to say that we've welcomed many new staff to the Trust, and I'm particularly proud of our international recruitment campaign, which saw a huge amount of staff join us. We've also had significant interest in people joining the Trust through our healthcare assistant recruitment days. We have a wonderful community of staff here that work in the Trust, and the diversity that each of them brings to our organisation brings new life, brings new ideas and brings new perspective to everything that we do. The actions and hard works of the hospital teams and partners have allowed us to continue to deliver levels of performance that benchmark well, often in the top 10 nationally when compared with other hospitals across the NHS. We've also put a number of improvement plans, including those around theatres, the progression of our estates master plan, which I'm hoping over the next few years that you'll start to see really come to life as new buildings come up on the site. Our strategic priorities are specialist services, local services and innovation. And we continue to work closely with our local partners, particularly around how we can deliver our services in partnership with our GPs, with community services, with services from the council and also the voluntary sector, because we know that we can achieve more in working together for you as our local population. We've also had a focus on our specialist services to ensure that they remain high calibre, and we're constantly looking at ways to improve those. One big emphasis for us has been our role as a partner in the Baines, Swindon and Wiltshire Sustainability Transformation Programme. And this partnership is really important because it allows us to work quite differently with organisations across Bath and Swindon, but also set clear objectives about how we will work together to improve the health and well-being of the wider population and our local population. We have progressed a range of initiatives which Salisbury Hospital has not only driven but also has played an integral role in driving the deliveries and improvements going forward. And that's something that we can be very proud of, and certainly something that we'll be maintaining in the future as well. We've also updated and agreed our quality improvement and digital strategies, and certainly our digital strategy has grown tenfold in response to the new ways of working that we've identified through the COVID pandemic that has certainly allowed us to do things differently. At the moment, our ambition is to deliver over 60% of our outpatients appointments virtually, and certainly the feedback that we've had from you indicates that this makes a real difference. It cuts out travel time, it means you don't have to find car parking on the site, and it also enables you to be able to attend an appointment when it suits you. We also receive an amazing amount of feedback from the people that use our services. When we receive negative feedback or opportunities for improvement, I want to assure you that we take this incredibly seriously. Our teams work really hard to identify where we got it wrong and what we can do to improve things. I'm delighted to hand over the realm to Stacey Hunter. She will be a fantastic Chief Executive for Salisbury Hospital, and I'm really looking forward to working as a partner with her in the wider system. And I'm delighted to give you the opportunity to also meet her today.
Hello, my name is Stacey and I'm the new Chief Executive of Salisbury Foundation Trust. Firstly, I want to say it's an absolute privilege and pleasure to join the team at Salisbury and get to work as your Chief Executive. A little bit about me, just so you can get a bit of a feel. So I've worked in the NHS for over 30 years. I've spent the majority of that time working up in the Yorkshire and Humber region, predominantly in West Yorkshire, and I've had a bit of a split career, so spent the first 10-15 years working clinically as a nurse and the last 15 years working in management and leadership roles. So I'm really excited about being here in Wiltshire, and whilst I recognise I've got a lot to learn about Salisbury, there's an awful lot about the hospital that already feels quite familiar in respect of the type of people that we are privileged to have that choose to work in our services, and the level of dedication and commitment that I can already see, feel and hear that people who come to work in our teams have for the care that they give to you, our local community. People are really interested, understandably, in what I think the kind of 2 or 3 priorities for the Trust are over the coming weeks and months. And I would say to you, I'm only in week 3, so in a way I'm still thinking about some of those, but what is really clear and really obvious is that we've still got to prioritise the work we're doing around keeping people safe from a coronavirus perspective. So that is about keeping you, our community, safe when you're coming in and using our hospital services, and also for me as your Chief Executive, making sure that our environment is safe for our staff to work in. That's quite a challenging time for us because we're also trying to restart as many of our planned services as possible, some of them that we weren't able to deliver in the height of the pandemic back in the kind of spring and summertime, and so it's a complex piece of work for colleagues who are trying to balance, you know, the different things in keeping people safe as they do that. I'm really impressed with their dedication and their commitment and their approach to that, and would ask you just to continue to bear with us as we do that. We know for some of you, you've perhaps been waiting longer than we would have liked for you to be able to access things, and I want to reassure you that we're working as hard as we can to get things back on track. I think the second priority for me is always going to be about the people, so you, our local communities, and understanding from you you what it is you need from us, both in the here and now and into the future, to help you keep health and well-being as good as it can be for you and your families. And that really is important to me as your Chief Executive. And running right alongside that is actually how I can, with my colleagues on the board, have an environment that people join in Salisbury when they choose to work with us that helps them have an outstanding experience when they come to work. Because if we can get that right, then they in turn can help you and your family have an outstanding experience every time you need to use one of our services. And then lastly, I think it would be remiss of me not to talk about some of the challenges we face. And whilst we've all been necessarily focused on the kind of pandemic and the virus for the last few months, there are other significant things that are important to me because they're important to you and your families. So for us, we need to continue to pay attention to things like our standards of care, whether that's how long you wait in our A&E departments, how long you wait for some of your diagnosis and treatment in our cancer services. They're all things that we have got to continue to pay time, attention and effort in, so that we can make sure you continue to access services that are performing really well. And then lastly from me, there is something about our overall sustainability as a hospital for its local community. You will know, I'm sure, from your day-to-day interaction with the news and other things that, financially, health services face quite a lot of challenge. And so we've got quite a lot of work to do with ourselves and our local partners in how we can continue to provide services in a way that offer great value for money and that keep pace with the times and are done in a way that keeps them sustainable for the next 5, 10, 15 years on your behalf. So just to conclude with you today, colleagues, I want to say a couple of really big thank yous. The first thank you are to my colleagues at Salisbury Foundation Trust. Whilst I'm only in week 3, I have experienced a lot of kindness, a lot of friendliness, and people have been really welcoming, which as the new girl, I've genuinely appreciated. And secondly is to say thank you to you for joining us at the AGM today, but also for the broader support that I know Salisbury Foundation Trust enjoys from its local community. I've seen many examples of that as I've walked around the hospital in the last couple of weeks, and I want you to know that that is really appreciated and we value everything that you do on our behalf.
Thank you, Cara. Thank you, Stacey. I'd now like to introduce Lisa Thomas, who's our Director of Finance, who will cover the financial aspects of the year 2019 to 2020.
Welcome to the annual look at the financial position at Salisbury. As colleagues might be aware, the accounts are made up of a group of organisations: Salisbury NHS Foundation Trust, the charity also known as the Stars Appeal, and our subsidiary businesses, namely Salisbury Trading Limited and Oddstock Medical. These have all been audited independently by Grant Thornton. They gave their opinion that the accounts were not materially misstated, and these were duly submitted to NHS Improvement and presented to Parliament within the appropriate timescales. I'm going to concentrate on the financial position of the Trust, excluding the charity, for the purposes of my presentation today. The Trust has been in deficit for a number of years now, having to borrow cash from the Department of Health to sustain delivery of services. In 1920, the Trust managed not to borrow, which is an improvement on the previous year. As part of the NHS funding regime, we are given a set of rules to follow, in addition to those you would expect of any organisation adhering to accounting standards. One of those rules is the Trust was given a control total. If the Trust achieved this, then we would be allocated additional funding, called Provider Sustainability Funding, PSF for short, overall leading to a planned marginal surplus of £1 million. The Trust started the year on track to achieve that financial position. However, the second half of the year yielded 2 challenges: a reduction in planned care activity, that is the elective and day case operations and therefore income, and a non-recurrent increase in costs associated with increasing nursing recruitment. Overall, the Trust did not achieve the control total and ended the year with a deficit of £10 million, losing some of that PSF funding. However, the Trust did deliver savings of £8.2 million. We focused on ensuring our theatres are utilised, our outpatients have reduced numbers of people not turning up, and we buy the best value clinical equipment we can get. The position was also impacted in March with the arrival of COVID-19, the biggest health crisis in a generation. Additional costs were incurred in March of £600,000, and a further 400,000 of non-cash expense included within the reported position reflects the cost of many staff deferring upcoming annual leave. The majority of our money is spent on people, our workforce. We are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, employers in the area. Our role as a local employer is cemented in the fact we spent 167 million on employment last year. Nationally, recruitment into NHS clinical roles is very difficult. There is a national shortage of clinical staff. However, our levels of temporary staffing have reduced. We are proud of our overseas nursing campaigns, resulting in fantastic new nurses from all over the world, most recently from India. These nurses make a difference to the quality of care we offer to our local population, and without them, both financially and clinically, we would be in a much worse position. The Trust focuses hard on ensuring each pound is spent in the most effective way, with 96 million being spent on drugs, clinical supplies, and ensuring buildings and equipment is safe to operate. Notwithstanding COVID, one of the biggest challenges going forward is the Trust infrastructure, the electrical and mechanical engineering elements keeping the estate working. This needs significant investment in line with the age of many of the buildings. The Trust received new funding in the last month, and we will be investing 3.4 million in 2021 towards improvements. The Trust is limited to what we can spend on capital. This is determined nationally due to our financial challenges and is limited to our annual depreciation level of 10 million. Unless, of course, we're lucky enough to be given additional central allocations from government. In terms of capital, whilst the cash position remains challenging, the Trust has continued to invest in ensuring equipment, digital and buildings are of the standard we would expect. This is no mean feat, with some buildings well beyond their useful life. We've done a number of small projects this year, including 4.5 million on medical equipment, including a new cath lab for cardiology, and we've spent 3.4 million on our digital infrastructure. The Trust has some way to go in addressing the needs of the modern digital hospital. Our financial challenges have not gone away. We remain in enforcement action by our regulators, NHS Improvement, due to our deficit. We are also working in a very different financial environment with post-COVID recovery. The rules, systems and financial flows are very different, with funding coming centrally for reasonable response to COVID. The regime for the rest of the financial year isn't even completely clear yet. What I can say is that the challenges to ensure we see and treat as many patients as this time last year are alive. The challenges around ensuring adequate social distancing, cleaning, ventilation and PPE remain in place. Consequently, we can't see as many patients in the same way as we did before. Therefore, we are working with our system partners in the neighbouring hospitals and our commissioners to deliver safe healthcare. We continue to work on how we can address our financial challenges without compromising the high standard of care we give. April 2020 has also brought about changes to cash borrowing. The debt the Trust had built up of 21 million has been converted to equity under the Department of Health scheme. Loans have been frozen and interest will cease to be payable. This is obviously welcome. What is important, that despite delivering a deficit position, the Trust can demonstrate in national benchmarks it is more efficient than an average hospital, it does better in performance targets than an average hospital. Therefore, I am in no doubt continuing to work differently and in partnership with local community, we can solve the financial challenges together. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lisa. I'd now like to introduce you to two of my clinical colleagues, Duncan Murray and Stuart Henderson, who will take you through some of the clinical challenges we've experienced in the organisation over the last 18 months.
Thank you very much, Nick. Hello everyone, my name's Duncan Murray. I'm a consultant anaesthetist working in intensive care medicine at the hospital and also the clinical director for surgery. And I've been closely involved in the Trust COVID response over the last several months. And in this presentation I'm going to outline our experience of COVID as it pertains to critical care. So by way of introduction, the virus that causes COVID-19 is a member of the family of coronaviruses, so named because of the crown-like appearance of the spike proteins on the viral surface. Now, although COVID-19 is a kind of new kid on the block, coronaviruses have been in circulation for some time, most notably causing the common cold and being responsible also for the SARS epidemic of 2003 in East Asia, and the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome outbreak, or MERS, in Saudi Arabia in 2012. So COVID infection is acquired and spreads directly, primarily through infected droplets or indirectly through contaminated surfaces. But in certain circumstances, airborne transmission occurs through infected aerosols. Now, aerosol formation is particularly important in the healthcare setting, where very stringent infection control measures and high-level personal protective equipment are required to protect staff and other patients from becoming infected. And it's the requirement for these measures that's a major factor confounding efforts to return particularly our operating theatre capacity back to pre-COVID levels of productivity. An aerosol generation occurs in many of the core interventions in ICU patient care, and as such it makes ICU a high-risk environment for staff exposure. Now, most COVID infections are either asymptomatic or cause only mild symptoms, but in a minority of cases the virus enters the lower respiratory tract and causes a severe inflammation of the lungs, as seen on these CT scans. This inflammatory injury to the lung causes impairment of the gas exchange function of the lungs and necessitates, in those cases, hospital admission for oxygen therapy, and then in the worst cases, other forms of respiratory support such as CPAP, as shown here, or invasive mechanical ventilation becomes necessary. Now, COVID is relatively highly infectious and has now caused nearly 30 million proven cases across the world. Although the true cases are likely to be much, much higher than that, and over 900,000 fatalities. In the UK, the first case was identified and reported on the 29th of January, just before the NHS declared a major incident on the 31st of January. The disease then spread rapidly through Europe in late February and March, particularly in northern Italy, and then also into Spain and France. And the reports and images and news clips of the huge pressure on hospitals in these areas, I'm sure, will be familiar to everyone. As we all watched events unfold in Europe at that time, new case numbers and hospital admissions and deaths unfortunately started to rise in the UK. And it was against this backdrop of a rapidly escalating respiratory epidemic with real fears of that acute medical and critical care services would become overwhelmed with demand that we prepared our critical care response in Salisbury. So for critical care, the primary objective was to very significantly expand our ICU bed capacity. Now, over time, at the time, we received varying requests, instructions from NHS England on the extent to which we had to expand further. But the most stretching but still broadly realistic target was to create up to 30 critical care beds, which was an increase of 20 above the 10 beds we normally operate. And to achieve this, we had to first identify an appropriate location for these beds and then work out how to staff and equip them to be able to provide safe and effective care. And we had to do this pretty quickly. A forever complicating planning and decision making at the time was the requirement to comply with very strict infection control measures aimed at protecting staff and non-COVID patients from infection. In the end, we created a non-COVID ICU in our main theatre recovery ward, and we repurposed 4 of our operating theatres and their anaesthetic rooms to provide COVID capacity in addition to our existing Radnor ward beds. And at the same time, we devised systems and processes to allow us to comply with infection control procedures whilst trying to minimise as far as possible the disruption and fragmentation of our newly expanded and inexperienced critical care workforce. To address the staffing requirements of these extra beds, we adopted a strategy for when COVID pressures increased of using our existing trained nursing and medical workforce to closely supervise and support these less experienced non-ICU staff in providing direct care, with the level of support and closeness of supervision varying depending on how far beyond our normal capacity at any time we became stretched. To bolster our nursing workforce, we used staff who had previously had critical care experience, and we also redeployed non-ICU nurses from various other services, including, for instance, operating theatres and day surgery, from our surgical wards, which at this point had significantly reduced patient numbers because we had curtailed planned surgery. In the same vein, we redeployed junior doctors with previous ICU experience back into our team. And we took advantage of the considerable expertise of our anaesthetist to support the initial assessment and emergency management of COVID patients, as many of these staff were also not fully occupied by operating theatre and other elective clinical duties at the time. This involved an enormous exercise in training and educating literally hundreds of non-ICU medical and nursing staff to be able to support critically ill patients, appropriately supervised and supported by expert ICU staff. These additional ICU beds needed suitable equipment for providing mechanical ventilatory support. As was widely reported at the time, this was in the context of a multi-pronged approach nationally to procure additional ventilator stocks, including an initiative to invent a functioning ventilator that could be manufactured quickly at scale. As it happened, we had to rely on the use of anaesthetic machines that we normally use in our operating theatres, which are a functional but imperfect substitute for an ITU ventilator. So having done our preparation, in the end, the anticipated potentially overwhelming surge of patients presenting with COVID fortunately didn't materialise locally, although the same can't necessarily be said for our colleagues locally in acute and respiratory medicine. In total, we ended up admitting 11 patients with COVID disease, 8 of whom were male, which is typical, but with a higher proportion of patients with a significantly raised body mass index. Now, despite this high proportion of obese patients, which is a known major risk factor, our mortality rate was 27%, which is below the 40% rate nationally, although our numbers are small. Our length of stay for both survivors and non-survivors was longer than the national average, which may offer some learning and reflection for us for further admissions, but again, the numbers are small, so it's hard to interpret that too accurately. But overall, our outcomes for our COVID patients compare very favourably with national data. So despite our low number of admissions, it's worth mentioning that the experience of COVID so far in Salisbury has still been challenging in critical care for several reasons. Above all, I'd say that staff have been subjected to unprecedented change and disruption in their professional lives, changing their working locations, their working relationships, forming new teams to care for patients afflicted by a new disease about which there's much still to learn. And all this on the backdrop of similar disruption in their personal lives that's affected all of us. The constraints of lockdown, separation from families and friends, prevention from pursuing hobbies and holidays, and potential financial worries, etc., etc. The list goes on. And so although locally we've not had the experiences that units in other parts of the country had, it's definitely still been an extremely challenging and difficult time for the entire workforce. And sitting across all of this have been concerns about personal safety and the risks of exposure to COVID, particularly in the known high-risk environment that is critical care. And often this anxiety has been inevitably exacerbated by appropriately but necessarily changing guidance on infection control measures and PPE requirements as the pandemic progressed. Another issue which continues to be a challenge is the significant burden of providing care whilst wearing high-level PPE, which apart from being uncomfortable and awkward, it significantly impairs communication with staff and patients in these high-pressure environments. And this is particularly relevant when working in unfamiliar teams of redeployed staff who are requiring close supervision and support. A further consequence of the particular demands of the pandemic situation has been the absence, or relative absence, of visitors at the bedside in ITU. This obviously makes communication with family members very different from normal, although we've devised ways of getting around that to some extent. But it significantly diminishes, and did diminish, our ability to convey the humanity and compassion that we're particularly proud of and feel is such an essential part of the care that we're able to provide under normal conditions. And then finally, although the peak has passed and relatively gently in Salisbury, it's clear that COVID will persist in our community for some time to come. And we're going to have to continue to accommodate this in the way we deliver all aspects of healthcare until this changes. And it's likely to have an ongoing impact upon staff providing critical care, as well as those patients receiving it, and for the families of those patients. So looking back over the past 6 months or so, what would be my reflections and what have we learnt? And a few things stand out for me. So we never came close to requiring the 20 extra beds we created, and in that sense we massively over-prepared, although I'm sure few would argue that under-preparing would have been preferable. However, in spite of the relatively low numbers, there were several weeks in April, May when we had 7 COVID patients ventilated on our ITU. And caring for these patients, even these small numbers, whilst admitting suspected cases at the same time as running a clean ICU in a separate location was a real logistical challenge. And of course we don't know what remains ahead of us with COVID locally, particularly heading into the winter. And so it seems unlikely that even though we did over-prepare, that the training and education and upskilling and drills, if you like, we've delivered over the last few months will not be put to further use again at some point, probably soon. Further reflections, if and when we're faced with further COVID demand, we now have proven therapies and some new knowledge of the disease that we know can influence the progression of the illness, and we'll be ready to apply this knowledge into our practice if required. My final reflection would be on what an immense privilege it's been to participate in the local response to this crisis. I've witnessed on countless occasions really the very best of what the NHS and Salisbury Hospital have to offer. To generate the response that we did required the efforts and dedication, the commitment, selflessness and resilience of staff in all parts of the organisation, as well as partner organisations, both inside and outside of the health service. It goes without saying that the hospital exists to provide a service to the local community, and I know that there was and continues to be an enormous amount of support for the hospital and staff within our community. I know this is really greatly appreciated by our staff, so thank you for your ongoing support.
Hello, my name is Dr. Stuart Henderson. I'm a consultant physician and the Clinical Director for Medicine here at Salisbury NHS Foundation Trust. I'm just going to spend the next 5-10 minutes talking through the medical response to the COVID outbreak earlier this year. So, as some background, which all of us will be familiar with by now, there was a novel coronavirus identified in Wuhan province, China, in mid to late December 2019. This was picked up early by the World Health Organization, with documented spread to mainland Europe late on in January 2020. From a Salisbury perspective, we were aware of this early, and planning began in earnest really towards the middle of February 2020. One of the early challenges we faced was simply the level of uncertainty and the high volume of information that was coming our way. Virtually every specialist, local and regional society in the UK forwarded guidance on how to manage their patients with coronavirus, and our own public bodies, Public Health England and the Department of Health, were providing new updates on how we should manage all aspects of care, from identifying patients to management, diagnosis and treatment, virtually on a weekly basis. It therefore became a real challenge to focus on the specific information that we felt was relevant and which could reasonably be ignored. From a personal perspective, a number of publications were what I focused on and what really formed the basis for Salisbury's response. Now, at first glance, they may seem a little unusual, but the first of these was the Handbook of COVID-19 Prevention and Treatment that was emailed to us from Wuhan University Hospital. Now, this was a 50-60 page booklet, but really contained very nitty-gritty information on how they learned, the hard way, it may be said, and how they managed to deal with the coronavirus outbreak. In addition to that, we also had really quite scary and intimidating information coming to us. We received these emails from colleagues in other parts of the world that really painted a really quite terrifying picture of health services being completely overwhelmed, about staff becoming ill and dying before people's eyes, and clinical teams really having to make quite unpleasant judgments that we in the UK have never really had to face before about who received care and how that was delivered. The next publication, which I drew inspiration from, for want of a better phrase, may seem a little unusual, but was pointed out to me by one of my colleagues whose husband is a senior position within the military, and this was based on guidance given to officers during training, and which in turn is based on the work of a Prussian general, von Clausewitz, on the art of war. And really the points in this: selection and maintenance of the aims, maintenance of morale, concentration of force, economy of effort, flexibility, cooperation, and sustainability really struck a chord with how we needed to manage the situation going forward. And I'll come on to these in more detail later. Building on that, therefore, my main aims to manage the medical response during the COVID-19 outbreak were as follows. Management of suspected and confirmed COVID-19 patients through dedicated pathways reflecting appropriate infection control measures. 2 was to ensure that the standard of care for all non-COVID-19 patients, e.g. those presenting with stroke, with cancer, with heart attacks, was maintained and to the same high standard. 3 was to protect our staff mentally and physically. I wanted none of my staff as patients on ITU or worse. And 4thly was to continually reflect on our approach and to adapt and flex as required. The next bit of information that I really took to heart was this, which I think came to us via the US and some respiratory physicians down in the southwest. And this was the 4 waves of the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, the first is what we were very much focusing on, but really for me, the things that we needed to really focus on was the second wave, the impact on everyone who didn't get care and treatment, which linked into the third wave, and also from my perspective, that 4th wave of the impact on the staff and on the economy and on society as a whole, because they're all interlinked, and how that would enable us to manage the response. So we had some pretty difficult decisions to make, and we effectively had to reorganise the hospital from the ground up to focus on one disease that was relatively unknown, that was highly infectious and had a high mortality rate for those who were poorly enough to ending up being admitted to hospital. So we had to make the following changes. We split our emergency department into 2, a respiratory assessment zone for COVID patients and a green zone for everyone else. In order to facilitate this, we moved our paediatric admissions direct to the paediatric unit. We moved minor injuries into the fracture clinic. We redesignated our acute medical unit for all non-COVID admissions to maintain that quality of care for non-COVID patients. We had to move our stroke unit up onto level 4. We had to move our elderly medicine rehab unit onto level 4. We had to move our gastroenterology unit out into the surgical team. And as a result of that, we were able to create a 60-bedded respiratory care unit on level 2 that could also provide high dependency unit level care. We also created 27 beds to enable patients to come out of intensive care, and sadly 27 bedded ward designed for end of life care and those requiring supportive intervention. Again, in order to facilitate this, all elective and planned care was cancelled. From a human perspective, we disbanded all of our medical rotas. We redeployed all surgical training and junior doctors into medicine, and as a result of that, established a standalone 24/7 medical cover rota to manage patients being admitted to hospital with COVID-19. You would get the same care whether you arrived at 3 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning on a Sunday. We also redeployed our palliative care specialists and our non-general internal medicine doctors, the rheumatologists, the oncologists, the haematologists, into managing the wards, and did the same thing with our nursing staff and created a standalone unit out of our existing teams. We upskilled our medical and nursing staff to manage respiratory disease and enhanced our IT infrastructure to allow remote consultation. We were told to plan for worst case scenario, which was that 20 to 25% of our workforce would be off with illness or caring for others at any one time. Therefore, we established a workforce group every morning that redeployed and flexed our medical and nursing staff to where they were most needed. We developed cohorting and testing strategies to make sure that we didn't miss any patients. And going back to our main aims, looking after our staff, what are seemingly simple things. We got our scrubs right, we got our PPE right, we established staff areas where staff could rest and regroup. We had free food and drink available for people. I can't underestimate the impact it has on staff working in a high stress area with large volumes of patients coming in, high numbers of patients critically ill, and high numbers of patients dying whilst wearing full level 3 PPE. It was hot, it was hard. Staff would get pressure sores on their nose and on their ears from wearing masks. It was hard work, and it was vitally important that we looked after our staff to make sure they in turn could look after our patients. I have a few photos in here just to show what we did. This was our respiratory assessment zone in ED and the basic planning of how we had to restructure everything, looking at everything from where the doors were, which could be closed, where the ventilation system was, our respiratory care units, and then pictures of our staff on the RCU managing the care for those patients. I know that looks like our nursing staff are relaxing, drinking wine. It's not. That's just to demonstrate that we looked after the staff and giving them good areas where they could relax. There was a donated bottle of water that we had was really important to us as the wider team. Going therefore onto how we did, I thought this is a useful slide and is what I used during the pandemic to manage our response and to escalate up and to flex down both in terms of space and staff accordingly. Now let me just explain briefly what this shows. The dates are along the bottom and the numbers on the vertical axis represent the beds in the hospital that we would need to use. The blue lines represent patients on the general medical wards. The green lines and bars represent the patients in the intensive care unit, which I know Dr. Murray has already referenced. The dotted blue line was our worst case scenario. The solid blue line was our best case scenario. Now you can see from here our worst case scenario was that we would need 200 beds in this hospital for COVID-19 patients. As you've already seen, with all of the adaptations that we had made, I could get us to reasonably 115 beds. Therefore, there was concern that if we entered a worst case scenario situation, we as a local trust would struggle. The bars along the bottom represent the actual numbers of patients in the hospital. Dark blue are confirmed positive, the light blue are those suspected but awaiting a test. And you can see as we enter the end of March, 26th, 27th, 28th through to the 30th of March, our patient numbers were rising on that trajectory as we were expecting. But then it shifts, and from the beginning of April, the curve flattens. And this had a massive impact to us. I don't think there is any coincidence that this flattening of the curve occurred exactly 10 days after the decision was made to go to national lockdown. And I'm quite clear that the reasons behind why we managed the situation well in Salisbury was a combination of good planning and foresight, but also the decision to go to national lockdown and the fact that it was very well adhered to by the vast, vast majority of the population made a massive impact. And I think it can be hard back in April when we were at home socially distancing and isolating to know the impact we had. But this is the impact it had. And we heard a lot from Chris Whitty and others about flattening the curve. This was the flattening of the curve in Salisbury. And we can see there that although the numbers of positive patients slowly rose during April, the total burden on the bed base, for want of a better phrase, remained relatively static. And we managed to look after all patients coming into Salisbury with COVID-19 through that 115 bed base model that we had managed to establish. Unfortunately, we never reached the unpleasant situation of the worst case scenario. From April onwards, numbers started to drop, and as we can see from here, total COVID positive patients dropped throughout the latter part of April into beginning of May, and I believe beginning to mid-June we discharged our last COVID positive patient, and then enjoyed a couple of month period with no patients in. The large spike you will see on the 30th of April for awaiting results is when there was a national decision to test all patients coming into hospital for COVID-19 as opposed to any other surge. So what were my reflections on this? I think the first thing I would say, and is my overriding feeling from this, is that the team effort from the clinical staff, medical, nursing, therapy, radiology, was absolutely outstanding. You know, I would frequently go home and just feel intensely proud of the way the 1,013 staff that are in the medical division responded to this challenge. There were no complaints. People adapted. We asked them to do incredible changes in a short period of time. All of the work we talked about earlier changed over a 3-week period. Our capacity planning and our modelling worked. And like I say, some of that was due to luck. Some of that was due to the national decisions with regarding lockdown. And throughout the 2-3 months where COVID was a significant challenge, we stuck to and achieved our primary aims. Going forward, challenges remain. Our workforce is tired as we now try to deal with the backlog of elective care and manage normal medical challenges plus the ever-present threat of COVID-19. How we maintain that balance of risk is difficult. Testing limitations, as we will see every day in the media, is very real. And until such time as we can get a reliable test with a quick turnaround, we will run into problems. But I think if I have to leave on a note, I would say that the local population of Salisbury and Wiltshire can be very proud of the way that all of the medical and nursing teams responded to this challenge. Thank you very much. I hope you found that useful. I'd like to introduce your next speaker, who is Violet, who is one of our patients who has been continuing to attend Salisbury Hospital throughout the course of this year.
I'm Violet Doyle. I'm 77 years old. I've got terminal cancer and I come in here for my treatment every 3 weeks. My son drops me off, I come in and then I go to tell him I'm here and we sit down and they said, we'll be with you shortly, and they said, would you like a cup of tea? And then they call us, they do our blood pressure and they test us. And do the temperature. And then we get taken into the ward then to have our treatment. It's been different, you know, but they've made me feel good because they've had the protection on, the masks and the aprons, and made me feel safe. We've got a nurse, Tina, and she's always very jolly, always singing. And so I love singing, so we have a good old sing-song, and we start the other patients off, and we have a good laugh here.
Fly me to the moon, and let me play amongst the stars. Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars.
It's such a happy ward, and you know, and that's the truth.
In other words, darling, kiss me.
Do you know, and I'm not just saying it, they've been amazing here. My treatments have been fantastic here. And from day one, I felt comfortable here.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm now going to introduce you to John Mangan, who is our lead governor. And in many ways, the governor are the sponsors of the AGM, and John will give you his view of the challenges of the organisation and how it's fared over the last 18 months.
Thank you, Nick. Hello. If I was to ask some people from our local communities or the staff of the hospital to whom the Trust Board was accountable, I might expect amongst their answers to include the Government Department of Health, and I would hope that they would say that the board is accountable to us, the people, and to us, the staff. And in the case of Foundation Trust, that is more tangible, more relevant, more immediate than what might otherwise be the case. Because you as members, the public and the staff, elect the governors from amongst their number, and we in turn appoint the chairman and the non-executive directors and hold them to account individually and collectively for the performance of the Trust Board. And I think there can be little doubt that when we're talking about performance, that quality of care would be top of the list as far as the people are concerned, and indeed as far as staff are concerned, their ability to deliver it, because that is what gives most job satisfaction, if for no other reason. Thinking about quality of care, what's foremost in the minds of governors has to be, is the hospital providing the range of services that one would reasonably expect to find in a district general hospital? Are those services provided to the required standard? Do people, when they use those services, feel informed, supported, and are they able to be equal partners in their own care? And when they come into hospital for treatment, is their safety assured and are they protected from avoidable harm? In short, does the hospital get it right for every patient on every occasion? Well, I don't think anybody can say that would be the case 100% of the time. It's not true of any healthcare institution worldwide. But we do know that it is right for most of the time. And we know that from as governors sitting and participating in boards, in meetings, reading endless reports on quality, both for internal and external consumption. And we know it from the feedback we get from our constituents. But you know it too from the high reputation that Salisbury has amongst its population. The high regard in which the trust is held and the hospital is considered is no more than a sum of the positive experiences that people have had from their or their families receiving services at the hospital. And of course, it was affirmed by the Care Quality Commission review, which rated the overall standard of care at the hospital as good. The Cqc report is in fact a sort of snapshot in time. Well, probably more than a snapshot because they were at the hospital for quite a long time and quite a big team of them. But nonetheless, it is a moment in time picture of how things were at the hospital. But it is a statement of the processes that are in place to ensure that quality of care is maintained and delivered. It's a statement of how well these processes are understood and followed by staff across all disciplines and grades and vertically throughout the hospital. It's a statement of the leadership provided by the board and how it monitors performance and takes corrective action as necessary. It's a reflection of what the visiting team were told by patients, past and present, and it's what they themselves saw during the time they were at the hospital. It is very heartening for me as a governor attending board meetings and participating and observing other discussions within the trust to know that quality of care is always foremost in their minds. It is their support for a process of always getting better, continuous improvement, sometimes referred to as a golden thread of continuous improvement, hoping to achieve that aim of an outstanding experience for every patient. For me, or as a representative of patients who come into the hospital, a more appropriate metaphor might be a ship's rigging, something where confidence in the vessel comes from knowing that the rigging is in place and well maintained and operated by an experienced and skilled crew. So thinking of the year 2019-20, the pressures that face the NHS overall were very present and evident here at Salisbury. The increasing demand caused by people coming through the door, more and more admissions, of emergency care in particular, the shortages of skilled staff, and the financial pressures, as inflation in the NHS always runs well ahead of general inflation. And that was reflected in the underlying deficit that was carried into the year and a rather ambitious efficiency saving programme. And if I'm allowed to continue with my nautical metaphor for another moment, I would also say they were entering uncharted waters. The NHS long-term plan had been issued a year earlier, and it had signalled the dismantling of some aspects of the internal market, payment by results and cost per case and competition, to be replaced by a new model of integrated care based on partnerships and collaboration and supported by block contracts. Yet the organisations that were put in place, the new regions and the joint up commissioning groups to lead on that integrated care planning were yet in their infancy. Yet the board welcomed the long-term plan and the commitment to integrated care, if for no other reason that it would better enable them to respond to the perennial problem of ensuring that people, once medically fit for discharge, were discharged. That is always better for them because it is almost inevitable that outcomes are poorer the longer people stay in hospital. And it is always the personal preference of people to be home and to get into their normal lives as quickly as possible. But it's also better for the rest of the hospital and patients as it maximises capacity and minimises disruption to planned care. The whole notion of integrated care was also reflected in the campus project, which was under development, because that project is not just the essential replacement of worn-out buildings, but it is about working together with other organisations and other sectors to help the patient flow and to enhance rehabilitation. During the year, the chairman, along with the governors, took the opportunity of vacancies arising amongst the non-executive directors to strengthen the non-executive team, particularly in respect of enhancing skills to support patient safety and quality of care, working between hospitals and primary care and between acute hospitals, and supporting our people, particularly in respect of diversity and staff welfare. And talking of staff, I would like to take the opportunity on behalf of the community served and the governors to welcome all of the international recruits, which was a highlight in the year as they joined, particularly the large cohort of nurses from India. Welcome to all of you. Your presence makes a huge difference to the Trust in terms of being able to continue into the future providing high quality care. The international recruitment, of course, had a non-recurring cost, which added to the financial burden of the year. And it was no surprise to anybody that midway through the year, the Director of Finance was formally forecasting that they would not achieve their financial targets in that year. And so the year would have ended had it not been for a viral visitor from the East. The arrival of coronavirus in the country put the NHS on an emergency footing. One of the immediate consequences of that was that all routine activity was suspended, and the government provided additional funds to enable every trust to have sufficient income to match its in-year expenditure, and it also converted accumulated borrowing in the trust into public dividend capital. The net effect of that was that the trust did meet its financial targets in year, and while it hasn't solved the problem of the underlying deficit, it has put the trust on a better financial footing to start when normality returns to the funding regimes for the NHS. I don't propose to say anything about the demand of coronavirus, since much of that impact fell in the current year. However, I would like to say this, and that is to thank all of the staff involved in the Trust response to it. When a national emergency was announced, the Trust implements its major incident plan, something that is well practiced and rehearsed, and indeed had experience of implementing just a few years ago with the Novichok incident. However, every incident is different, and this one more different than anybody might have planned for. It required a significant commitment for all concerned to quickly respond. This was a new illness for which there was no known cure or treatments, and created significant risk both for the patients and indeed for staff. And on behalf of the communities, I would like to thank especially the frontline staff for their professionalism and selfless dedication to responding to that emergency. And I include within that staff such as housekeeping, whose contribution to ensuring infection control is at its best, can never be overstated. And what is little known outside the walls of the hospital is that Salisbury hosts one of the most respected and successful laundry and procurement services in the NHS, both of which were to make a significant difference in the response. Indeed, while the Prime Minister was at JCB asking them to switch production from earth-moving machinery to ventilators, the Trust, because of its good fortune and good timing, was taking delivery of ventilators. It is just an example that demonstrates that there can be no doubt that the rigging of the vessel that is Salisbury Hospital is in good order and well prepared for the stormy seas that it was to face. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thank you all for listening to the presentation. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers once again for their contributions. If you have any questions about the content of this presentation, you have an opportunity at 4:30 on the 28th of September to attend our virtual Q&A session, where we'll be able to answer some of the questions that either have been raised by the topics today or are on your minds with regard to the hospital.